Hello my friends, stay a while and listen. It's Q here from Retro Q Gaming and I want to take you back in time. And despite going so far back in time, there was still things that we have to this day very prevalent, mainly the console wars, something that has existed through generation to generation of console over the years. From new companies rising to old companies fading into obscurity. From vicious ad campaigns to the weirdest of celebrity endorsements. From Mode 7 to blast processing, we are going to take a look through the years at the console wars. We're going to see how they played out on this side of the world, and how I persevered, how I survived, and what side I chose, and how that played out for me. Over the next couple of videos, we'll see how all this went. But for now, let's take a look at the 8-bit era, more officially known as the third console generation, but depending on who you watch and where you listen to your content and all from, this actually will probably be a little bit different from what you're used to. I'll give you a perfect example. Like myself, I listen to the majority of kind of retro YouTubers and retro gamers and whatnot are usually American. They obviously have a very different story from here in Europe. Of course, there's some high-profile European ones as well, and you might have heard it from them, but let's go anyway. So of course, when it comes to the third console generation, we're mostly looking at systems like the NES, the NES as you Americans like to incorrectly call it, the Sega Master System, and even the Atari 7800. But chances are, your favorite YouTuber or whoever, your favorite retro gamer, they probably are North American, and they probably grew up just like all the others over there. They probably grew up with the NES. They probably grew up with Mario. And of course, Nintendo being Nintendo, to them at least, saved the console market. Which I will add, for a simple fact, did not actually happen in Europe and Japan, because gaming was fine. The video game crash from the Atari 2600 was strictly an American thing, or strictly a North American thing, because, well, Canada too. But here on the other side of the Atlantic, there was a big difference with what was going on. While you had the NES eventually selling 34 million units in just the American territories, in the same period of time, here in Europe, it didn't even hit 10 million. As a perfect example, way back in the day, I knew strictly 2 people, that's right, only 2 people that had a NES. I only ever played a NES twice until I got my own one a few years ago. And even then, when I did play it twice back in the day, it was even after the Super Nintendo had already come out. But here in Europe, we had mainly 2 different alternatives, one of which was the Sega Master System. Now technically the Sega Master System did sell a little bit less than the NES here in Europe, but it did so in only a few years, versus that figure I gave you for the NES here is over 20 years. Whereas Master System did almost as many in 6 or 7 years. So while the Master System generally was more common and more popular here, I will say this, that wasn't our number one. If you grew up in Europe in the late 80s and early 90s, there was something else that you were playing on, most likely, and it was not an Atari 7800. Because here in Europe, specifically Western Europe, but obviously spread out throughout the whole continent, we had an absolutely massive influx and adoption rate of what we only kind of call the 8-bit home PCs or 8-bit computers. Now these are usually considered things like the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, the Amstrad. You have things to that effect, and those were far more prevalent than you had with the NES or even the Master System. In fact, like I mentioned, I knew 1 guy with a Master System, 2 people with a NES, and every single other person I knew had a Commodore 64. There was like 1 guy who was the unlucky guy who had an Amstrad, and 1 other one who was really unlucky and had a Spectrum. But everyone else, myself included, had a Commodore 64. And Commodore 64s were very popular over here. Specifically the model that would accept cartridges and cassettes rather than diskettes. I still have all my Commodore 64 games, dozens of them, and I don't have a single diskette-based game. In fact, I don't even have a diskette drive, because the really popular Commodore 64 model that was over here back in the day was less of a computer-looking style one and less of the one with the PC-style monitor. It could just connect up to a regular TV with an external cassette deck. So while everyone else over in the US and whatever was playing Mario and Zelda and Metroid, we were over here playing all sorts of different stuff. Bubble Bobble, Sly Spy, Ghosts and Goblins, Ghouls and Ghosts, Midnight Resistance, Target Renegade, the Dizzy games, DJ Puff, the New Zealand Story. So many different games from so many different publishers and so many different ports all made it over here to us on the 8-bit computers, if you will. Of course, I'm not trying to detract from the experiences all the North American viewers out there have. Just like you grew up playing Mario and loving it to death, I may have grown up playing something different on a system you might not even know existed, simply because regional differences. And that's kind of why I wanted to make this video. It puts out a different perspective, very, very different from what you're probably used to hearing. And so, with that, I managed to survive the 8-bit era with the Commodore 64, all the way up until the next video in the 16-bit era. So be sure to keep an eye out for that video coming soon, and we'll see how the 16-bit era played out here in Europe and for me. As always, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the rest of the videos in my channel.